Picture a house built entirely out of mirrors, every single wall reflecting back a version of a person who never actually existed. For 30 years, you watched them polish those mirrors while shattering everyone who dared to walk through the front door. You carried the weight of their chaos, the exhaustion of their games, and that deep, haunting fear that maybe, just maybe, they were going to get away with all of it. But there's one thing even the most skilled manipulator can never bend to their will, and that's time. Take a breath with me for a second because I see what you've lived through. You're not just watching this because you're curious. You're watching because you're searching for the answer to a question that's kept you staring at the ceiling at 3 in the morning for years now. Does it ever actually end? Is there a moment where the universe finally collects on the debt owed for decades of silence, tears, and stolen dignity? The answer is more unsettling than you might expect. For 30 years, this person has moved through the world like they'd mastered some dark art, absolutely convinced they were the exception to every rule that governs human decency. They've torched bridges and then acted shocked when you weren't the one holding a bucket of water to save them. They've cast themselves as the victim while their fingerprints were still fresh on the weapon. And somehow they always seem to find a new crowd willing to believe their story. But that crowd is shrinking now. The theater they've been performing in is getting colder and it's getting quieter. Most people picture karma as some dramatic lightning strike, a single explosive moment of public humiliation where the truth finally gets shouted from the rooftops for everyone to hear. But for a narcissist, the real consequence is something far more psychological and far more permanent. It's a slow motion crash into the emptiness they built inside themselves, piece by piece over decades. After 30 years spent consuming the people around them to fill a hole that has no bottom, they're finally starting to run out of people to feed on. You've probably spent countless hours wondering why they never feel guilty, why they never wake up one morning and recognize the damage they've caused. You've searched their eyes for some flicker of humanity, some sign that underneath it all, they actually care. I want to tell you something important. The victory you think they're celebrating is really a sentence they're serving in real time. They aren't winning. They're just getting more skilled at pretending the walls around them aren't closing in. This 30-year mark matters because it's usually right around when the supply starts drying up for good. The charm that used to work effortlessly on strangers now reads as a kind of desperate performance. The children they once controlled have either grown up and walked away, or they stayed and turned into quiet shadows of themselves. The partners have either left entirely or checked out emotionally long ago, and the narcissist is left standing in the middle of a graveyard, made up of every relationship they've ever had, still gripping a shovel, still looking for someone new to bury. There's a very particular kind of dread that creeps in for someone who spent 3 decades running from their own soul. When your entire existence is built around projecting your shame onto everyone else, what happens once you finally run out of places to run? That's the question we're going to sit with today. This isn't about vengeance. It's about the slow, mechanical failure of a life constructed entirely out of lies. You might still see them out there at family gatherings or scrolling through their social media, still wearing that same smug, self-satisfied smile, still acting like the ruler of their own tiny kingdom. But look closer. Look at their eyes. There's a frantic energy sitting there now. A quiet panic that wasn't present 10 years ago. Somewhere underneath the performance, they're starting to sense that the world has moved on without them, while they remain trapped in the same cycle of resentment and bitterness they built with their own 2 hands. This isn't just a satisfying story about a bad person finally getting what's coming to them. It's really a story about the physics of the human heart. You cannot spend 30 years sowing discord and expect to somehow harvest peace at the end of it. You cannot spend 30 years tearing other people down and then expect to feel valued once you're old and frail. The bill always comes due eventually, and the currency required to pay it, things like empathy, love, and genuine connection, is something they never once set aside for themselves. So let's pull back the curtain together. Let's look at what really happens once the lights go down and the narcissist is finally left alone with the one person they've spent 30 years trying to outrun, themselves. This is the truth they don't want you to see. This is the quiet karma that's already unfolding, even if the bruises aren't visible yet from the outside. It's time to stop waiting for their downfall and start recognizing that they're already falling. To really understand the karma facing someone who spent 30 years like this, you have to understand what's actually driving them underneath it all. It isn't power, and honestly, it isn't even ego in the way most people think of it. It's a bottomless, terrifying void built entirely out of shame, For 3 decades, they've used you and everyone else in their orbit as a human shield to keep that shame from ever touching them directly. They've treated the people around them like a mirror that's only allowed to reflect back a god, never a flawed, ordinary human being. Think of their inner psychology like a house where every light is switched on, but nobody's actually home. They've spent 30 years decorating the front lawn to impress the neighbors while the plumbing quietly rots and the roof slowly caves in behind the scenes. Every single time they hurt you, it was really a desperate reach for some feeling, anything at all, other than the hollow ringing they hear inside their own head. They didn't choose you because you were weak. They chose you because of your light, because of the warmth and depth they could never generate on their own. They operate on a purely transactional level, even with the people who are supposed to matter most to them, their own children, their own spouse. For 30 years, the people around them were essentially objects to be used, repositioned, or thrown away depending on how useful they currently were. But here's the strange psychological glitch buried in all of this. When you treat people as objects for that long, you eventually lose your own ability to recognize yourself as a full person too. You become nothing but a stack of masks with no actual face underneath them. That's really where the true collapse begins. Just imagine the sheer mental energy it takes to maintain a lie for 30 straight years. They have to keep track of every different version of the story they've told to every different person. They have to remember who's currently in favor and who's currently the villain of the week. It's an exhausting, staggering amount of cognitive labor to carry. As they get older, the brain naturally starts to lose some of its sharpness, and that's exactly when the masks begin slipping. They start mixing up which lie belongs to which audience, and the cracks in the whole facade start showing through. Their internal world is essentially a battlefield where they're simultaneously the general and the only soldier fighting the war. They're perpetually on the defensive, always braced for the moment someone finally sees through the performance and recognizes who they really are. After 30 years of this, that hypervigilance curdles into something closer to genuine paranoia. They stop seeing friends and start seeing potential traitors instead. Everyone becomes a threat, because everyone theoretically has the power to glimpse the emptiness underneath. They've never built what you could call an emotional retirement fund. When you move through life with kindness and genuine empathy, you slowly build up a reservoir of goodwill that carries you through your later years. People want to be around you because of how being near you actually makes them feel. The narcissist, on the other hand, has spent 30 years withdrawing from everyone else's emotional account without ever depositing anything back in. By the time they hit that 3-decade mark, they're socially bankrupt and there's no one left willing to bail them out. The passage describes how narcissistic patterns can become increasingly destructive over time. The narcissist remains trapped in a cycle of control, competition, validation, and chaos, constantly seeking external admiration because it never creates lasting satisfaction. As they age, the strategies that once gave them power, such as charm, appearance, manipulation, and social influence, may become less effective. Their need for attention can become more desperate, while their social circle gradually shrinks as people recognize their patterns and establish boundaries. A major turning point can occur when children, former partners, friends, or others stop playing their expected roles. The narcissist may then portray themselves as the victim or martyr, blaming others for the isolation created by their own repeated behavior. The central message is that time exposes patterns. After years of choosing control over genuine connection, the narcissist may find themselves surrounded by possessions and stories of past victories, but lacking authentic relationships. The passage ultimately encourages the reader not to feel responsible for rescuing someone from the consequences of their own repeated choices. The old games stop working, the mask becomes easier to see through, and the narcissist is left confronting the emptiness that external validation never managed to fill. They're searching desperately for a way out, but they refuse, absolutely refuse, to look inward for it. They keep waiting for some miracle that will magically restore their former glory. But the only thing actually waiting for them is silence. And in that silence, for what might be the first time in 30 years, they're forced to sit with the sound of their own heartbeat. This is where the karma stops being theoretical and becomes genuinely tangible. Some people call it the great emptiness. After 30 years of tormenting the people around them, the narcissist isn't met with some vengeful, punishing force from above. They're met instead with an absolute deafening nothing. They look back across their own life and see nothing but a trail of wreckage behind them. But because they've never developed any real capacity for remorse, they can't even use that wreckage as material to build something better going forward. They're locked into a loop of perpetual resentment that never resolves. Maybe the most honest consequence of all is the slow loss of their own grip on reality. Because they've lived inside a self-constructed fantasy for so long, they eventually lose the ability to tell the difference between what actually happened and what they've simply invented to protect themselves. Their cognitive dissonance becomes a kind of permanent state of being. They start to genuinely believe their own lies, which only makes them look more and more delusional to everyone watching from the outside. It's a form of mental erosion that starts somewhere deep in the soul and slowly works its way outward. Physically, the toll of living as a narcissist for this long is enormous. Existing in a constant state of fight or flight, perpetually scanning for threats and quietly plotting their next move keeps the body flooded with stress hormones for decades on end. By the 30-year mark, this often shows up as chronic health problems, which they then weaponize as one final tool of manipulation. Even their illness becomes a kind of performance, a way to guilt someone into providing one last drop of attention and care. They lose the capacity to feel even small, ordinary sparks of genuine pleasure, because their sense of joy was always tied to devaluing someone else or winning some petty competition. They don't know how to simply enjoy a sunset, a quiet meal, or an easy conversation for its own sake. Their nervous system is essentially fried from 30 years of high-stakes emotional drama. Everything ordinary starts to feel boring or beneath them unless it involves conflict or some way to inflate their own ego. In a very real sense, they're bored nearly to death. The truly unsettling part of this karma is that they slowly become a caricature of themselves. Every trait they once used strategically or kept hidden becomes their entire personality by default. If they were once mildly stingy, they turn into an outright miser. If they were once slightly arrogant, they become a full-blown megalomaniac. Without the filter of social awareness holding things together, their true, unflattering nature ends up on display around the clock. They become a living embodiment of the exact traits they use to mock in other people. Think about all the holidays, birthdays, and milestone moments over the years. For 30 years, they managed to sour these occasions for you. Now, if they're even invited at all, they sit through these same events like a ghost haunting the feast. They watch the genuine laughter shared between the people around them, and it triggers a spike of pure resentment because they simply don't know how to join in. They never learned the language of real connection. It's like standing outside in the freezing cold, watching a warm family dinner unfold through a window they can never actually walk through. They're haunted by the people who managed to get away. In their quietest moments, they remember the individuals who were genuinely good to them, the ones they destroyed simply because they had the power to. And it isn't even the person they miss. Not really. What they actually miss is the high-quality supply that person used to provide. They eventually realize far too late that they traded something precious for a handful of gravel, and there's no getting that back now. That regret, selfish as it is at its core, is still a bitter pill they have to swallow day after day. Even their physical home starts to reflect their internal state over time. Whether it's a sprawling mansion or a modest apartment, there's an unmistakable sense of stagnation everywhere you look. Things break and simply stay broken. Dust settles quietly on the trophies from past victories that no longer mean anything. There's a stale, forgotten smell hanging in the air. A narcissist's home after 30 years of this pattern often feels like a museum dedicated to a war that ended a long time ago, except the soldier inside refuses to accept that the peace treaty was ever signed. They become fixated on the idea of their own legacy, despite having none to speak of. They try desperately to rewrite their own history, spinning stories of their greatness to anyone patient enough to listen, but there's no one left to actually corroborate any of it. Their life story reads like a book missing every supporting character, just a single protagonist who becomes less and less likable with every passing chapter. The real terror sets in when they realize that once they're gone, the dominant emotion felt by the people who knew them will simply be relief. This is the final stage of the whole collapse, the slow dawning realization that they never actually mattered the way they always assumed they did. For 30 years, they believed they were the sun, and everyone else was just orbiting around them. Now they're forced to see that life goes on perfectly well, sometimes even better without their presence in it. The world is entirely indifferent to their rage and their tears. In the end, they're just someone who was cruel for a long time, and now they're simply someone who is alone. That, in the end, is the real karma. If you're still here with me, I want you to really listen. Not just with your ears, but with everything you've carried through this. You've lived through a war that had no front lines and no visible uniforms. You've been gaslit, devalued, and discarded by someone you once genuinely trusted. You've spent years waiting for the universe to finally balance the scales on your behalf. But the truth is, the most important part of this whole journey was never really about their collapse. It's about your own awakening. Their karma belongs to them. Your life belongs entirely to you. You need to understand, clearly and fully, that you were never the problem. You were only ever the mirror they were desperately trying to see something beautiful in. When they couldn't find it, they tried to shatter that mirror instead. But you are not broken. You're simply scattered. And every single piece of you is still fully capable of reflecting light. Those 30 years of hardship they put you through are proof of your strength, not evidence of weakness. You survived something that felt, at times, unsurvivable. Real healing begins the moment you stop scanning their life for signs of justice being served. Whether they're miserable in a mansion or lonely in some small apartment doesn't change the one fact that actually matters, which is that you are free. Every minute you spend wondering whether they're suffering is another minute of your own precious life handed over to them for nothing in return. You've already given them enough. It's time to turn that same curiosity inward, toward your own beautiful, still healing soul. There's a deep, genuine peace available once you accept that you don't have to be the one who punishes them. The natural laws of psychology and time are already doing that work quietly, without any help from you. You don't need to shout the truth from the rooftops, because the truth is already written plainly in their own hollow, empty eyes. You're allowed to set your sword down now. You're allowed to stop standing guard over the prison built from your own memories. The gates are open, and you have full permission to walk away. Try picturing your life 30 years from now. If you stay tethered to their ghost, you'll end up just as bitter and hollow as they are. But if you let go, truly let go, you get to build a life defined by what you love, not by what you manage to survive. You get to become someone who's kind, precisely because you know exactly what cruelty feels like from the inside. You get to become someone who's deeply authentic, because you understand firsthand how much a lie can wound another person. You get to turn all that heavy lead into something like gold. The frightening karma facing the narcissist is a life completely devoid of real love. The beautiful reward waiting for you as a survivor is a life where love finally becomes possible again, precisely because you've stared directly into the darkest corners of human ego and lived to tell about it. You're now uniquely equipped to appreciate the simplest, quietest acts of grace, a sincere apology, a moment of honest mourning, a friend who actually listens without an agenda. These small things are your real treasures now. You've earned a depth of character that someone like them will never be capable of understanding. Please don't let your own heart turn to stone just to match theirs. There's nothing they'd love more than knowing they succeeded in changing you, in making you just as cold and suspicious as they've always been. The real victory here is staying soft in a world that tried its hardest to harden you, continuing to love, continuing to trust again, wiser this time around, and continuing to believe that you genuinely deserve a life filled with peace. Your joy is the one thing they can never take from you, and the one thing they absolutely cannot stand. So go out and find it, deliberately and without apology. For anyone still in the thick of it, or anyone who's just recently gotten out, I promise you it does get better. The fog eventually lifts. The shaking eventually stops. That voice inside your head that sounds exactly like them starts to fade bit by bit until it's nothing more than a faint whisper you can easily choose to ignore. You're in the process of rediscovering who you actually were before they told you who you were supposed to be. That person never left. They've been waiting patiently for 30 years and they are overjoyed to finally see you again. This story, this exact moment right now, is really a bridge. On one side sits the wreckage of their 30-year campaign. On the other side is a wide open field where the sun is finally starting to rise. You don't have to keep glancing over your shoulder. You don't need to check the rearview mirror to see whether they're still chasing you. They simply can't run anymore. They're stuck in the mud of their own making, permanently. You, on the other hand, have wings you haven't even fully used yet. The narcissist's deepest fear was always being forgotten. And in the end, that's precisely what happens to them. They become a shadow, a footnote, a cautionary tale that nobody bothers repeating after a while. But you become a living, breathing testament to just how resilient the human spirit really is. You are the light that made it through the darkness intact. And remember this above everything else, the most terrifying form of karma a narcissist will ever face is simply watching you thrive fully and completely without ever needing to look back at them again.